Welcome back to the State of the Nation. With me today, we've got the CEO of the Institute of Race Relations rejoining us, John Endres. John, welcome back to the State of the Nation. Good to have you here.
Thanks for inviting us back, Mike.
Now, John, I noticed that you've been in a few sort of media, there's been a bit of media about you recently because of a trip that you took to the US. Where you went and spoke to a few business organizations. I think there were a few politicians thrown in there.
Yes.
And you were a South Africa spokesman. How did it go?
Oh, it was very interesting. So the background really to the trip is that the Institute of Race Relations has had relationships with people in Washington for well over 40 years. So even during apartheid times, already the Institute was building relationships and networks overseas. It has maintained those over the years. And really my purpose now in going back was to revitalize, revive, and rekindle those acquaintances. And the kinds of networks that we're talking about are people in the think tank community, the foreign policy community, some people in the defense community, as well as politicians. And the purpose really was to present ourselves, introduce ourselves as the IRR, and also to get a sense of what Americans perceive when they look at South Africa from a foreign policy perspective or looking at the country as a whole. So it was a fact-finding mission as well as an introductory mission.
And the fact-finding mission, you went out there just to see, what is the opinion, what is the view of South Africa from Uncle Sam?
Well, let's say it's not uniformly positive.
Yes.
I think that would be quite clear. I think that the assessments differ quite a bit depending on the person you speak to. And there seems to be some difference as well in terms of the political leanings of your counterpart. And so what we found is that quite a lot of people, especially on the Democrat side, had very great hopes for South Africa after 1994, of course, so did the Republicans as well, and find it difficult to come to terms with the state of the nation as it is at the moment. The gap between the hopes and the reality is just so great that it has caused a lot of dismay in the United States, in my interlocutors. And they're very worried about what's happening here. However, this was really overshadowed by the foreign policy aspects of the relationship.
Yeah, because one could say that the new South Africa was really birthed as, in the early days and the halcyon days of Bill Clinton. And it was very much, it had the stamp and the fingerprints, much like some of the interns of Bill Clinton all over it, isn't it?
Yes.
The new South Africa, right? So I suppose and that was a direct reversal of the Reagan-Bush senior sort of attitude towards South Africa, with especially towards the ANC.
Yeah, and I think, you do need to look at that in some nuance and some detail. I think that the Republicans were driven by the idea of constructive engagement. So saying, one way to foster change in South Africa is by remaining engaged, but by applying pressure while we are in communication with South Africa. So you had the Sullivan Principles, for example, that included American companies in South Africa explicitly deciding not to comply with the racial classification system in terms of petty apartheid at the time.
But oddly enough, implementing the first bit of BE in a way. So they weren't. They were the forerunner of what became the legislation we grapple with today, isn't it?
Exactly. And I think in terms of laws especially, our constitution is very much modeled on several Western constitutions, including that of Germany, that of Canada, as well as that of the United States. And our constitution has been hailed and continues to be hailed as the best constitution in the world. I think that is not a universally held view, but it is certainly a very good constitution. And the West, I think, invested a lot of its capital, its political capital, its hopes, its desires, its aspirations in South Africa. Having seen the process of decolonization and the way it played out in the rest of Africa, the results were not entirely satisfactory. And the hope was that South Africa could be different and prove to be a beacon to the rest of the continent and show how things could go better. And that hope now seems to have been disturbed or maybe even destroyed.
Yeah, because there's no doubt that our constitution has suffered a bit of hail damage. I like that one. Over the last couple of years, as the people that are empowered or employed or appointed to safeguard that constitution have been the biggest abusers of the constitution, namely the successive governments. I always see that visual in my mind of Cyril Ramaphosa getting the Zondo commissioned reports from Chief Zondo, and then I presume he went and sewed it into a part of his furniture or something like that. Because
most likely,
we haven't seen much attention given to that particular document. But let's go back to your experiences in the US. A lot of it coincided, and I'm not sure whether you were that prescient, but certainly your visit tied in with this big question mark over AGOA.
Yes.
The African Growth and Opportunity Act, right? Which
Yes.
basically puts us in a little bit unfairly with a whole lot of really sort of whacked out countries to get access to the US market. Sort of like a bit more than we deserve, because I suppose this was to help countries that are completely shattered, if I'm not mistaken. But, we are there. We do derive a lot of economic benefit from AGOA, access to the US market without tariffs and so on. And there's been some question marks as we've cozied up to Vladimir Putin and stroked him on the head. What do the US think of well, let's start in two places. Let's first talk about where do we start? Do we start talking about AGOA, or do we start talking about South Africa's foreign policy?
I think we should start with the foreign policy.
Yeah, because the foreign policy needs to be spoken about, and then we can see the effect of AGOA. And, sometimes the lady doth protest too much. And the Lady Pandor at every point says, we're completely neutral.
Yes.
We never support Russia, even though we do military maneuvers with them.
Yes.
We love telling everybody how much we love Russia. We keep on voting in favor of Russia at the United Nations. And we think that the rest of the world is going to treat this as neutrality.
So I think the United States, from the people that I spoke to, is not opposed to the idea of non-alignment. So they don't have a problem with South Africa saying, look, we don't really want to take sides in this. That'd be perfectly fine. But what really riled up the Americans was saying that we are non-aligned while aligning with one of the sides, which is very clearly the Russian side. And that is something that has caused escalating unhappiness, I would say, over the course of the past year, starting with the various UN resolutions where South Africa refused to condemn Russia's invasion. They either abstained or just made sure that they didn't have to take a position on this, which was noticed. It caused some raised eyebrows. It caused a little bit of unhappiness. But things then got even worse.
Especially because it came hot on the heels of a condemnation, and then a day later a reversal of that position, which made it clear that that wasn't always our position.
Exactly, yes. So, our international relations has been blowing hot and cold and also sending contradictory messages. So I think there's a certain degree of confusion as well in the United States about what South Africa actually wants. But let's leave that aside for now and just sort of focus on the perceived alignment with Russia. The naval maneuvers with the Chinese and the Russians, I think, caused another eyebrow to be raised. And then finally, the alleged supply of armaments or military material to Russia on the Lady R ship really was the straw that broke the camel's back. We saw the American ambassador at the time, Ruben Brigetti, I think in May, holding a press conference where he let rip, in a very undiplomatic fashion. And even as I heard the news of this, I thought, okay, here the ambassador has blown his top, and this is important. It's quite significant what's happening here.
Yeah, because there's no way as an ambassador is going to say what he said. And for those that didn't get didn't follow it, the US ambassador to South Africa, which is an important ambassadorship because South Africa being the sort of last great African hope, said he would lay his life on it that we sent something back on the ship as it was returning to Russia. And once again, the government just wouldn't open up and then buried it in yet another commission of inquiry, which came out and absolved the government of everything.
Very, very unexpectedly.
Very unexpectedly,
yes.
Yeah. Could have saved us all a lot of money, but anyway.
Exactly. And the ambassador, I think he did go out on a limb. So I'm sure he discussed it with some colleagues. I'm not sure he had clearance to do what he did, but he went ahead nonetheless. And I think what he did was something very important. It was an unorthodox move. It was a brave move. It could have gone badly wrong. But I think in the event, this gamble paid off for him and for the United States, because what it did was demonstrate to the South Africans how important this was for the Americans, which I think to that point maybe hadn't been quite clear. It seemed like our foreign relations were a little bit adrift. We were sort of ambling along, going along with, Russia suggesting some naval maneuvers. Yeah, we'll say, sure, that sounds good. We'll have some naval maneuvers. When should we do it? Well, it's on the anniversary of the invasion, which I don't think is a plan that our government came up with. Yeah. So I think that is an idea that came from outside. But not to have noticed that and not to have seen how that would be perceived, I think was a failure on the part of our international relations establishment. We've also not been very good at explaining to the Americans what our position is. And that lack of clarity allows these misunderstandings to escalate and to become bigger and bigger until we eventually had this blow up from the American ambassador.
Not helped by the fact that our ambassador to the US has been off duty for 6 months or something crazy at the worst possible time.
Yes.
So, I suppose the question as to what South Africa's attitude is towards America has kind of been made. I suppose in the absence of statements, people are going to draw their own conclusions.
Yes.
It seems quite hostile. And hovering all over this is the fact that the US remains by far our biggest market, excluding raw materials where China's tips America. But
yes.
Hey, at the end of the day, to anybody that doesn't understand economics, it's quite easy to ship raw materials. You need a couple of miners, you put it on a ship and away it goes. But to export cars and finish things, you need factories, you need those same raw materials. The value chain is that much higher. The number of people employed, it's not just purely a numbers game. It's also about what we are exporting.
Yes.
And we're exporting all the stuff we're dying to export to the US and the EU and Britain, and we are not necessarily handling those relationships that well.
Well, exactly. Like our industrial policy does have the aspiration of beneficiation. That's been a stated policy aim of the Trade and Industry Minister. But what that means is taking your raw materials and transforming them through the input of labor, know-how, energy, et cetera, into something more valuable. And so those beneficiated products really are going to the developed markets like the United States and Western Europe, whereas the raw materials, which are the ones that we are not actually wanting to promote that much, are the ones going to China. So yes, I think our trade policy has not been really well aligned with our international relations.
Well, if we're looking for a bad alignment, we've got to first talk about our Minister of Trade and Industry, talk about a guy badly aligned for his job. I mean, sometimes, if that is a bit of a joke. I suppose it's the biggest joke since Castro made Che Guevara his Minister of Finance.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Right. That's sort of one of those beautiful political appointments, which I think is also meant to send a message. You put a guy least in favour of trade or industry and make him Minister of Trade and Industry.
Well, I think we do have a slight problem with not deploying our best and brightest, both locally and abroad. And coming back to the United States, I think that has been true, of the ambassadors that we've deployed there, who in this instance, I think, failed on two accounts. And the first one was to explain to Pretoria what Washington was thinking, and to explain the escalating unhappiness on the other side of the Atlantic. And secondly, it was to explain to the Americans what Pretoria was thinking. And if you're not doing those two things, then I think you're really failing in your role as an ambassador and as an embassy. And that is a huge problem, which is now what we've started to see happening. We've seen a lot of delegations now being sent from South Africa to try to fix things up. I think that has been well received and well perceived as well, even when these delegations didn't always seem as well prepared as they might have been. So we had heard stories about appointments with senators being cancelled or not being taken up, which is not ideal. If you're trying to patch up relations with somebody who's angry with you, you've got to show up to the meetings. And I think that is where the shortcomings are coming to bite us. We just need more professionalism in our foreign relations, but of course also domestically.
Okay, but let's now move on. You did have the opportunity to speak to a couple of influential bodies and people, and a lot of the discussion was around AGOA. And you've made the point that you don't think it's in this agreement or our inclusion in AGOA is in peril.
Yes. And I think what has happened here, I must go back a little bit to explain it, which is that I think the administration has one set of policies on South Africa. And usually technocrats hold a lot of influence and they proceed in quite a measured and balanced way. Things are quite different once you get into the realm of the politics. So South Africa did well over the past decades not to be noticed by Congress, but through its action on Russia, it has been noticed by Congress. So we saw letters from some congressmen in February, and more recently as well, a bipartisan letter to the Secretary of State complaining about South Africa. And this is where the danger really emerges for South Africa, is to draw the attention of Congress to yourself, because then you are at risk of becoming a playball of political interest, of domestic political fights within the US. However, my sense was that at this stage, the administration is still on board with keeping South Africa within AGOA, and the political side, the letter from those 4 congressmen, I think, was an attempt to preemptively diffuse the situation. So rather than allow South Africa to become this playball of competing interests with an uncertain outcome, can blow up in any direction, those 4 congressmen said, okay, let's do something about this. So let's formulate a letter and raise our concerns and focus on something that is actually a kind of a minor issue, which is whether South Africa should be hosting the AGOA forum later in this year, which is actually not that big of a deal. Who cares where the forum gets held? If it was moved, it would send a signal, sure, but at least they're getting ahead of the development and trying to diffuse the situation. So I think that was positive from South Africa's perspective. It helped to diffuse the situation a little bit. And I think that in this sense, the interventions by the South Africans helped. The fact that the Russian president, Vladimir Putin, was disinvited from the BRICS summit in South Africa, I think was very, very important. I think if that hadn't happened, then the pressure to kick South Africa out of AGOA would have been greater than it is now. So at this stage, I think the pressure will be kept up a little bit because it's a useful tool of leverage in foreign policy. But I think the risk at the moment is low that South Africa is going to be kicked out.
And there's also the case to be made that if you were, from the US perspective, you'd probably rather maintain that leverage.
Yes.
And keep South Africa on board rather than have this whole southern tip of Africa hostile to American and Western interests. I presume that's also a factor.
Exactly. So that this is again like the rational technocratic assessment, where you would say, look, if we're going to kick South Africa out of AGOA and maybe take away some more privileges, downgrade the diplomatic relationship, what we're doing effectively is driving South Africa into the arms of Russia and China. Do we really want that, or is that a consequence we're willing to accept? And I think that is where cooler heads have prevailed and say, well, actually, that's probably not what we want. So let's keep AGOA in place. Gives us leverage, also keeps South Africa a little bit removed from China and Russia. And not last, I think that there's a lot of innate goodwill towards South Africa and the United States. So I think people are disappointed with the way things are playing out, but they still harbor the hope that things will get better. And if they can play a role in that, they want to. They do want to make it work.
I think that the biggest enemy to South Africa and the future of South Africa isn't so much being cut off. It would be indifference, in my opinion.
Yes.
We slip off the map. Nobody really cares. Do whatever you want to do. Who cares? Kind of situation. You're going to do it anyway kind of feeling.
Yeah.
And we seem to have been back on the map where nobody can treat us with indifference purely because we're a little bit unpredictable and mad. And you've got people acting outside of their own economic interests. And when that starts happening, bells have to go off.
Exactly. And, I think you saw it in the international headlines where for the past few years, South Africa has really slipped out of the news.
Yeah.
So previously, during apartheid, of course, South Africa was in the news. After the transition, it was in the news. There was this great story to tell. The great Nelson Mandela was leading the country. But for the past 10 years or so, I think we've pretty much disappeared out of the headlines.
Yeah, it was from the moment they handed over the World Cup that I think South Africa's been out of the news.
Yes.
Barring the odd little bit of political porn, to see Zuma getting numbers wrong or to see Malema saying something inflammatory.
Yes.
The rest, who cares? Yeah, you can't keep the lights on. It's a bit peace in the news once on a Sunday when news stories are a bit low, isn't it?
Exactly, yes. And I think when my predecessor, Franz Cronje, went to Washington, I think the last few times he probably battled a bit more than I did now to get appointments. Because people would say, there's this South African coming, he'll explain South Africa to us. Sure, it's interesting, but is it really worth the investment, the time investment? And this was different this time around. So it was easy to get the appointments. People were interested. They did want to understand what was going on. And they also wanted to figure out what the way forward should be.
Now, while you were in the US, I happened to be in the UK. And, there seems to be sometimes South Africans, we've drifted out of the cycle as well. Those places are flipping red hot. We are not just sort of being sidelined. We are moving backwards at a rate because those economies are growing. Yeah. They are overheating. That's why they're putting all of those interest rates up now. We are missing the absolute motherlode, as we did with the big minerals boom, didn't we? The resource boom over the last couple of years, where our sort of capacity has diminished, investment has diminished, thanks to some more policies made it almost impossible to be a miner in this country, mining company. You must have had to deal with that.
Yeah, I mean, it sometimes feels like the score sheet is 85-0.
Yes. Against
South Africa, and all of those are own goals.
Yes.
So it really is unbelievable. Yeah. The way we keep shooting ourselves in the foot.
Yeah. I mean, my experience, and admittedly it was, largely London-based, but you literally have help wanted signs in the windows. They have not just got full employment; they've got a desperate problem in getting labour.
Yes. And
you can see it in the prices. The cost of living prices are going through the roof because they're having to pay people so much to do, what they needed to before. And, I actually had somebody here the other day, the very sort of pro-BRICS, anti-everything stance, saying, well, it's so bad in the UK. Well, listen, it wouldn't look so bad to me because that place is going like crazy.
Yeah.
And what was your experience in the US?
It was the same. So, I was only in 3 places in the US, really. I was in Maine and Washington and New York. But across those places, certainly my impression was that the economy has, I think the compounding effect of sustained economic growth has accumulated a level of prosperity now that is really impressive to see, which I think the locals don't perceive to quite the same extent as we do coming from the outside and having missed out on growth over the past decade and a half. But it is amazing to see the quality of the infrastructure. In Washington, for example, all the buildings are the same height because there's a height restriction on buildings. So you get these like 10-story office blocks, square, all the way down the roads, all over the place. When I was there, it was very hot, 35 degrees, and you'd be walking along the road. A door would open in one of these office buildings, and a blast of cold air would hit you. And you'd say, oh, that is so amazing. And then you'd think, well, in this building, every single office is air-conditioned. On this block, every single building is air-conditioned. In the city, every single building is air-conditioned. And they managed to do this, with no load shedding, no outages. It's an amazing accomplishment,
Yeah, so we are really missing a hell of a ride. And what it does tell me, John, and I mean, you would have found this in some of your talks, is that this isn't just about AGOA, are we staying in or out? That almost becomes a sideshow to the real issue of while we grapple around with having incompetent people in key positions, we are missing out on an opportunity that's a mile wide to join in this global carnival at the moment, aren't we?
We are. And I think, taking a sort of a slightly longer perspective looking forward, I think there's a very big opportunity coming that we're also going to miss out on. And this is that we see labor costs in China, for example, now rising. And cheap manufacturing, I think, is going to move out of China. And it's going to look for a different place to be located. Latin America is one obvious candidate for that, but so is Africa. But if we're not positioning ourselves for this, we're not going to get that opportunity. So if the governance isn't right, if the infrastructure isn't being rebuilt, the rule of law isn't respected, then that money is going to go elsewhere.
Well, you can't have manufacture without electricity. You can't have manufacture without power.
Yes.
And it must have taken some explanation on your behalf, standing in front of an audience of esteemed people to explain load shedding to them. How did you navigate that?
Well, it was even worse than that, because I had to tell my audiences that I had to travel to the United States to take a shower. Because you'll remember a few weeks back, Johannesburg was without water because of maintenance. So, I had to take an unwashed trip, which is not my preference, and then take a shower in Washington. But the same with electricity. It's hard to imagine for the people living there that such a situation could prevail or even exist.
Yeah, especially when we don't come off that base. We come off a base of a lot of electricity, and the country's built on a mountain of coal. So it's pretty hard to explain.
Yes, and that is a point we try to make here, is that we think that pushing the green transition too fast in South Africa and in Africa is to the detriment of these poor countries. And South Africa at the moment, I think there's a very strong argument to be made to go back to coal, despite its polluting effects, and to say, well, South Africa and also Africa more broadly emit, I don't know, is it 4% of the world's emissions? It's pretty small given the scale of the continent. It's a really large place. And they are not going to be able to transition as quickly as the rest of the world because they don't have the resources to do it. So go back to the established, proven technology, refurbish the coal stations, get them fired up again. They're already connected to the transmission grid. They're already located in the right places. The technology is one that is well understood. Let's get that working, get the economy growing again, and then aim for a transition over a longer period and say, by all means, let Europe and America, let the developed countries rush the transition, push it as hard as they can. They've got the resources to do it, but give the poorer continents some more time to catch up.
Yeah, because what has to be said is that the first world has basically exported their emissions, hasn't it? Because all the manufacture is taking place in places like China, and now they're saying, well, it's not us. Yes. I've heard this a dozen times in Britain, right?
Yes.
It's not us. We produce 1% of the world's emission. Go to China, they do 20% of the world's emission. Yes, they do, because they're making all of your stuff.
Yeah, but now you see the carbon border taxes being introduced by the European Union, for example, where they will say, well, how much carbon went into producing the plastic shoes that you're sending over here, and we're going to tax the equivalent out of it. So I think that is going to be reflected. But again, it's going to be to the detriment of these developing regions that I do think need more time to catch up.
Yeah. So, it's hard to get a sense of whether our government has an electricity plan or not. We went from, I don't know where we stand right now. I don't know. We've got a bit of a cheerleader in Josienso Ramokgopa.
Yeah.
Who looks more like, he reminds me, now I'm going to go back to people, you're going to have to bear with me. I remember Abdul Bamji. I don't know if you ever remember that name.
I don't know.
He used to run SA football back in the 80s, and he was almost like half a CEO and half a cheerleader and half a... He reminded me a lot of Fikile and Balula. He would talk the most wild stuff ever and talk up these games and be almost sort of this figure of fun. Right, and Ramokgopa looks the same. I mean, I don't see what he's doing other than running around a lot, doing a few interviews in inappropriate clothing, and then saying, well, we're only keeping the lights on because we're burning a shitload of diesel. That's all I hear from him. Are you aware of any plan with regards to more electricity production? It doesn't seem like there is.
I think we're getting more electricity almost without a plan.
Yes.
Just in terms of the private sector introducing alternative energy supply mechanisms, from rooftop solar to large solar plants, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that is going to start making a difference. And I think, load shedding, we're going to get out of load shedding with or without the government. I'm pretty sure of that. What I'm detecting from Ramokgopa is some erraticism. But at the same time, I'm also seeing this message about coal coming from him, which I think is good. I think he is promoting that message, and doing so despite very little backup, I think, from civil society. So whenever he says something good about coal, he'll get all of the energy experts weighing in and saying how terrible coal is, and how the transition must be pushed, because that is where the developed world wants us to go.
But I can't really see. I mean, I can understand the coal argument, which I would fully want to, we want to kill this electricity thing because it's an economy killer.
Yeah.
Right? You can't grow, you can't live. It kills your enthusiasm. You lose the will to live.
Yeah.
Right? Quite simply. So it's something that in the modern day we need these things to work. But the last time we attempted to build power plants, right, we never got the power plants.
Yeah.
We never got the electricity. So when you say coal's a solution, I'm not 100% seeing how, because yes, we could take a couple of rickety old power plants and maybe patch them up. That'll get us back to where we were maybe, 15 years ago. But, save building more power plants. I don't see how that's our solution.
Well, I mean, in the 1980s, I believe South Africa was building one new coal power plant every 18 months. So it's possible. And I think in the case of our plants, what probably needs to happen is, a pretty thorough gutting in some cases and refurbishing. So you keep the shell, you replace the insides, and make sure that they work properly. It's a justified concern. How do you get the performance and the competence to do this? Because that's what we haven't had. Eskom, I think, has not performed as well as it should have because of political interference, because of a lack of law enforcement, because it is pursuing political and social engineering goals instead of pure engineering goals, which is to produce the most amount of electricity in the most reliable way at the lowest cost. That should be its focus. And anything that detracts from that should not be its focus. If Eskom gets that kind of support, then I think it would be able to do it. But it would have to let go of some of the shibboleths of running state-owned enterprises, which is the political interference, the social engineering goals that detract from the mission of the company.
So, John, let's move it back to the institute that you are the CEO of, which is called the Institute of Race Relations, right?
Yeah.
We've said a lot and spoken about economics.
Yes.
How much work do you do with regards to race relations?
Well, we promote, as we have done for over 90 years, strict non-racialism. And that gets us into hot water sometimes because it is not, I think, the prevalent way of looking at the world. We live in an environment that likes to focus on race. When we do surveys in the public, however, we find that most South Africans are not particularly race-focused. The relations between the races are pretty good, and people have priorities that rank far higher than caring about the race of another person. And those priorities really are the basics. So it's having electricity, having a job, having a decent education for your kids, being able to walk home from work in the evenings without being assaulted or raped or murdered. Those are very basic needs that need to be satisfied. And so our focus is really in criticizing government policies that work against achieving those priorities, and also suggesting policies that will work towards achieving those policies. And that is the essence of our work.
Do you think that's a reasonable position to have in a country like South Africa? Mm-hmm. Do you think it makes sense for the Institute of Race Relations to say non-racialism is what we're doing? We live in South Africa with a terrible history.
Yeah.
That's largely been around race, social engineering one way. Now we've got social engineering in a different way.
Yeah.
To suddenly say, guys, the solution is let's not see race. Well, turns out we're humans and we're going to see race. Let some taxi cut you off in the morning and see what suddenly comes out of many people's mouths, or something similar. Do you think it's fair for you guys to say non-racialism?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think where the focus really should be is on reducing and eliminating poverty. And that is where the focus is not at the moment. So we have a policy set that we call economic empowerment for the disadvantaged, which proposes to be a means-based rather than a racially focused empowerment policy. And by the nature of the distribution of income and wealth in South Africa, that kind of policy would mainly benefit black people who are predominantly poor, certainly much more than white people are, but it would take race out of the equation. And the reason for doing that is that if you promote race-based policies, you are perpetuating racial inequality, racial division, and a racial focus, rather than overcoming it. If you want to overcome it, you've got to remove it from the center of attention and focus on social mobility. You need to make it possible for people, no matter what their skin color is, to be able to advance in their lives, to become wealthier, to make progress, and to see their families being better off no matter what race they are.
But it sounds, something that I'm sure you've encountered so many times. It sounds like what I'm hearing is, let's protect the white position.
Well, it's not really that, because what it does is it takes race out of the equation, or attempts to do so, while recognizing that these disparities exist in South Africa. But if you're trying to shorten their duration of existence, then the current approach is not working. What we're seeing at the moment in South Africa is that inequality has increased since 1994. We've seen that inequality within the black population group is higher than in the population as a whole. That means if you removed all whites out of the equation, inequality in South Africa would go up, it would not go down. So in other words, the set of policies that we've got at the moment in terms of racial preferencing benefit a very small section of the black population to the detriment of the very large majority of the population. By our estimates, BEE policies help about 15% of the black population. They do not help 85% of the population. Those 85% of the population are dependent on state services in education, in security, in health, in electricity provision. All of these things are provided by the state at a terrible level of quality, and that terrible level of quality is because of cadre deployment and because the mission focus of these organizations is not quality and service delivery and price. It is social engineering. You've got to take that out in order to improve the services.
Now, this has been tried, and most recently we saw some serious rioting in France. Now, France, interestingly enough, practices non-racialism. They have no statistics on race available at any level. And most other European countries do, but the level of race-based unhappiness and rioting and so on is much higher in France, where the conclusion was drawn that it's the non-racial policy. It's the policy of saying, oh, well, we're all the same. Whereas the inner city and ghetto areas are almost solely sort of manned by people of color. And, is that not what happens when you say, listen, guys, we do not see color? In fact, I don't even know who lives in Diepsloot. I'm sure there's all kinds of people. Well, that's just not fair. It just can't be said.
Well, I mean, would you rather be poor and black in France or poor and black in South Africa?
No, that's not really the argument. That's a bit of a straw man argument. I'd
It's
say,
not.
what is the best policy for South Africa?
Yes.
Is it non-racialism? I see no race, which brings forward a whole lot of questions, very uncomfortable ones.
Yes.
Right? Or do we say we are aware of race and we're tackling it?
Yeah, so it's not a straw man argument. And the reason I say that is because France and Germany have produced levels of wealth far in advance of South Africa. They have managed to uplift their entire populations. Discrepancies remain and should be addressed. But nonetheless, I think it would be far better for South Africa to achieve a level of development comparable to Germany rather than being stuck in what we are at the moment. And for as long as we maintain the race-based policies that we've got, we are going to remain behind the levels of development of other countries. We are hurting ourselves by doing this, and we are hurting the poor people as well. That is what we need to move away from in order to get growth. I think that's absolutely essential. And I think that a non-racial perspective is very much defensible in the sense of replacing it with a means-based one and saying that if you are a poor person or born into a poor family or poorly resourced, you should get support in order to be able to progress in your life, no matter what your race is. And in South Africa, 95% of the cases, that is going to be the black population. So the effect of those policies is going to be, it's going to be an effective way of empowerment rather than an ineffective way, which is what we've got at the moment, which is not working. The evidence is clear to see. We've got 33% unemployment. We've lost 1,600 Rand in GDP per capita in the last 15 years. Our public finances are shot. The infrastructure is collapsing. How can we continue with this policy set? It's indefensible. I can't see how you can make an argument for that.
Yeah. Well, John, I think, look, I mean, so often I have this discussion with a range of people.
Yeah.
Race always comes into it. The question is whether one acknowledges it or not, whether one puts it front and center.
Yeah.
You are saying front and center, probably not a good idea because it leads to the kind of outcomes we've seen.
Yes.
And
the evidence is in, So if you want to do this, we've been doing it for 30 years.
Yeah.
But, it hasn't been great. It especially hasn't been great for the poor people, who are the ones who are meant to be helped by this.
Yeah.
I think it's not very good.
Yeah. Well, John, at least you come back from the US. There is some hope. There's still some people over there that want South Africa to succeed. I think that's the message that we get, isn't it?
Very much so. And I think, we've got this rift between the United States and South Africa at the moment, diplomatically. It is being somewhat healed, but I think that the relationship between these two countries could be far closer than it is at the moment. What it takes is better communication and a better understanding of each other's positions. So it's to a very large extent, I think, a communication shortfall.
Well, John, thank you so much for making the time to be with us today. John Endres, CEO of the Institute of Race Relations. To everybody that's watched The State of the Nation, thank you so much for joining us today. If you've watched this long, you might as well subscribe to the channel. We are growing, and we want to keep on bringing interviews like this for you. John Endres, thank you very much. To everybody who's watched us, thank you very much. We'll see you soon again on The State of the Nation. Thank you.
Thank you.